You're looking at actress Jayne Mansfield, who in my opinion was one of the most savvy female actresses ever. Why? Because she took her 40-22-35 measurements and dumb blonde persona and turned it into a Hollywood career and made it seem believable. It's been said that Vera Jane Palmer could speak 4 languages other than English. She played the violin, and her IQ was over 160, right there with Einstein. If this is not true, it only proves that Jayne was smart enough to convince us it was. Unfortunately, the public never got the chance to know the real Jayne Mansfield because of her short life. Jayne was born Vera Jane Palmer on the 19th of April, 1933, in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania. She was an only child. Her mother, Vera, taught school, but quit to take care of her baby. Jayne spent her early childhood in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where her dad, Herbert William Palmer, was a practicing attorney in partnership with the future New Jersey governor, Robert B. Minor. When Jayne was 3 years old, in 1936, she lost her dad from a massive heart attack while he was driving the car that she and her mother was in. Vera managed to stop the car safely. Mr. Palmer was 32 years old. In 1939, when Jayne was 6, her mother married Harry Piers, who moved the family to Dallas. Jayne began using his last name and became Vera Jane Piers. At the age of 12, she was taking lessons in ballroom dancing. She also took violin and piano lessons while studying several foreign languages. Jayne lived in Oak Cliff and attended Highland Park High School in North Dallas. Her Highland Park Junior yearbook shows Jayne performing in an orchestra with 3 other girls. In her junior year, at a Christmas party, she met Paul Mansfield, who was a sophomore at the University of Texas at Austin. Mansfield soon became her high school sweetheart. They were discreetly married on the 28th of January, 1950, and she will continue living at home while staying in school. After graduation, the 17-year-old Vera Jane Mansfield gave birth to a daughter, Jayne Marie, on November the 8th, 1950. As a young mother and wife, Jayne participated in a local theater, and in 1951 she enrolled at the Southern Methodist University to study acting. In 1952, Jayne enrolled at the University of Texas at Austin, where her husband Paul was attending. Her mother helped to watch Jayne Marie while they attended classes. Paul graduated in January of 1952 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant under the ROTC program. The Korean War was going on, and he will eventually be sent to Korea. Paul promised Jayne that when he returned, they had moved to California so she could pursue her acting desires. After his tour of duty was over in April of 1954, he kept his promise. Paul found work as an usher at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, and also got work in a public relations firm. Jayne was also taking part-time jobs to help pay the rent. The couple had been drifting apart for some time. Paul was not comfortable with Jayne's peroxide blonde hair and her sexy persona she was trying to create. They parted ways in February of 1955, about the same time that Jayne appeared semi-nude in Playboy magazine. Later on, Paul will use the Playboy pictures in court in an attempt to get custody of Jayne Marie. His attempt was unsuccessful. They will divorce in 1956. Paul will later marry in June of 1957 Mary Sue Greer, whose husband had passed away. He will adopt her son Robert. Paul James Mansfield will pass away on June 8, 2013, at the age of 83. In 1954, shortly after Jayne and Paul arrived in Los Angeles, Jayne knew the value of publicity and turned to Jim Byram, a former nightclub promoter. Jim managed to get Jayne a meeting with a producer at Warner Brothers, who told her to go home and be a good wife. For a while, she was getting nowhere, until she was picked to pose for Playboy magazine. That got her noticed, and then the studio offered her a contract. Her first film was a supporting role in Female Jungle that she was paid $150 for her performance. After filming, Jayne went back to selling popcorn at the local movie theater where she was working. The next year, in 1956, Jayne will have a starring role in The Girl Can't Help It, where the hoodlum Fats Murdoch, played by Edmund O'Brien, employs Tom Miller, played by Tom Ewell, to transform his girlfriend, Jerry Jordan, Jayne Mansfield, into a singing star because he trusted Tom with his girlfriend. However, they fall in love, and on top of that, Jerry Jordan can't carry a tune. In 1957, Jayne will do a cameo appearance in Guide for the Married Man that stars Walter Matthau and Ingrid Stevens. Also in 1957, it'll be The Wayward Bus. Jayne will play Camille Oakes, a burlesque dancer on her way to a good paying job in San Juan. On the bus with her is others with their own problems, including Joan Collins and Dan Daly. Two other films in 1957 will be Burglar and Kiss 'Em For Me. However, another film that year was Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter? This time Jayne starred with Tony Randall. A small part was played by Mickey Hargitay, who in 1955 had been Mr. Universe. Jayne had met Hargitay the year before in 1956 while he was performing with the Mae West Revue at a club in New York City. 20th Century Fox didn't want Hargitay in the movie, but Jayne insisted. She described Mickey as her only love. The studio wanted their sex symbol to be single. Going against the studio, Mansfield and Hargitay married on January the 13th, 1958. Hargitay was a Hungarian bodybuilder and came to the U.S. in 1947. He married Marge Bridge on the 2nd of April, 1948. They had one child, a girl, Tina. The same year Jayne and Mickey married, Jayne will star with Kenneth Moore in The Sheriff of Fractured Jaw, where an Englishman accidentally becomes a hero for stopping an Indian raid on a stagecoach and was made sheriff of a rough town. Although he knows nothing about guns, the dance hall gal, Jayne Mansfield, does and saves the sheriff that she falls in love with. 11 months after their marriage, Jayne and Mickey will have a son, Mickey Hargitay Jr., born on the 21st of December, 1958. Now this is 3-month-old Mickey Jr. with his parents at the Swedenborgen Wayfarer Chapel, the same chapel where his parents were married. Mickey Jr. is now the owner of the Mickey Hargitay Plants in Hollywood. It has remained a fixture in Los Angeles for years. In 1959, Jayne flew to London to play in Too Hot to Handle. That was later changed to Playgirl After Dark to placate the U.S. censor. Jayne's career was beginning to slip, and this is the first movie she had made that was not for 20th Century Fox. They began to lend her out to other studios. Now the next year, on August the 1st, 1960, the Hargitays will have their second son, Zoltan. He'll become an actor in later life and work at Paramount Studios. 1 year after Zoltan was born, Jayne will star with Ray Denton in the biographical film The George Ralph Story, about the actor George Ralph and his contacts with organized crime. In 1963, Jayne will be in Promises, Promises with her husband, Mickey Hargitay. where after a drunken spree on a cruise ship, two women discover they are with child. They set out to find out who the daddy is. In this film, Jayne was the first major actress to perform a nude scene since the post-silent era. The next year, on January the 23rd, 1964, Jayne and Mickey had a daughter, Mariska. She'll grow up and become an actress, director, and philanthropist. Jayne and Mickey will divorce August the 26th, 1964, after 6 years of marriage. After the divorce, Hargitay will marry Ellen Sino. 1 month after Jayne's divorce from Mickey, she marries Italian-born film director Matt Cimber. The marriage was short-lived. They separated after 10 months and divorced on July the 20th, 1966. Their marriage produced a son, Antonio, or Tony Cimber. In November of 1966, Jayne took her children to the theme park Jungle Land, USA, in Thousand Oaks, California. She was doing a photo shoot with movie animals. The lions were tethered to trees on a 7-foot chain when 6-year-old Zoltan wandered too close to an agitated lion. The boy's skull was crushed and neck punctured. 2 workers prized the lion's mouth open and released Zoltan. He was taken to the Conjo Valley Hospital in serious condition. He'll undergo several brain surgeries before recovering. That same year, Jayne started living with her attorney, Sam Brody. Brody's wife, Beverly, filed for divorce, naming Jayne the 41st woman in Sam's life. Sometime around the 14th of June, 1967, Jayne's oldest daughter, 16-year-old Jayne Marie, accused Brody of beating her. The court awarded temporary custody of Jayne Marie to her dad's uncle and wife. This was about a week before Jayne was booked at a supper club in Biloxi, Mississippi. Jayne, along with Sam Brody and Jayne's 3 children that she had with Mickey Hargitay, arrived in Biloxi on June the 28th, 1967. Jayne Mansfield was performing her nightclub act at the Gus Stevens Supper Club in Biloxi. The supper club was located on the vacant lot at the corner of Beach Boulevard and what is now Veterans Avenue. Jayne was scheduled to appear from June 23rd through July the 4th, doing 2 shows nightly at 9 and 11 p.m. While performing at Gus's, Jayne was staying here at the Cabana Courtyard Apartments, located a few blocks from the club. On the night of June the 28th, after the 11 o'clock performance, Jayne, her attorney, and partner Sam Brody, and a young employee of the club, Ronnie Harrison, loaded up Gus Stevens' wife's automobile, a 1966 Buick 225 Electra, that they had borrowed to go to New Orleans so that Jayne could appear the next day on WDSU's midday TV show. Now, this photo of Jayne sitting in what appeared to be that 225 Buick Electra is uncanny. We don't know who took the picture or when, but it is believed that the vehicle that Jayne was traveling in to New Orleans that night is this one. Jayne had 3 of her kids that she had with Mickey Hargitay, her second husband, sleeping in the back seat. 20-year-old Ronnie Harrison was appointed driver with Brody in the middle and Jayne next to the passenger door, where she could easily get out and attend to her kids. Around 2 a.m. on the morning of the 29th, the Buick stopped at the all-night White Kitchen restaurant for a bathroom break, and Jayne talked to cafe customers that recognized her and bought sweets for the children. The White Kitchen is now gone, with only the foundation left. Approximately 6 miles west of the White Kitchen and 1 mile west of the Wrigley's Bridge, the Buick, traveling at a high rate of speed, rear-ended the back of a slow-moving 18-wheeler, killing all 3 adults in the front seat, sparing the 3 sleeping kids in the back with only minor injuries. The next day, Mickey Hargitay and his wife Ellen flew to New Orleans to pick up his kids. Mickey stated in an interview later that Jayne had called him the night of the accident from a gas station to talk about their kids. She may have called him from the White Kitchen restaurant on Highway 90 shortly before the tragedy. He said their conversation was cut short because someone whom he believed to have been Brody was hurrying her up to get off the phone. She was explaining that she had decided to travel to New Orleans after her last performance around midnight instead of waiting till the next morning to go. Even though by doing that, she had to tell Mrs. Bennett, who was owner of the apartment complex where Jayne was staying and was babysitting for her kids. Mrs. Bennett had to wake the children up and get them dressed for the trip. The idea was to get to the Roosevelt Hotel where they had reservations so that they can sleep a little bit before the interview. Vera Jayne Palmer, Jayne Mansfield, was 34 years old.